This is BBC1 in the southeast. Now the news at 10 o'clock with Michael Buerk and Gillian Joseph.
The Tories have promised to abolish taxation on ordinary people's savings. Their sums don't add up, says Labour, as tax becomes the election battleground. The head of the prison service threatens to resign over degradation in his jails. And fears of mad cow disease hit America's love affair with beef.
In the southeast, if you're still thinking of travelling on the tube tonight, don't. London Underground promises a normal service, but in the morning. Left off the map, the delights of Dartford town have been snubbed.
Good evening. Labour and the Conservatives set out different plans to cut taxes today, fighting over what looks to be the key battleground in the coming election. The Tories promised to abolish tax on the savings of everybody on the basic rates of income tax. Labour said their sums didn't add up, and across-the-board tax cuts threatened public services. They've been publicising their plans for a targeted child tax credit, which was announced in 1999 and is due to come into force in April.
Now it's savers who are in line for the latest promise of Tory tax cuts. Not just pensioners, but anyone with cash put by. The strong economy means all the parties can afford a show of generosity, and there'll be more inducements on offer before the election. But today, the Tory leader, William Hague, offered to end tax on all savings below the upper tax rate, a reward for thrift.
Conservatives understand why savers have bothered and why they should continue to bother. Our society and our economy are stronger when people provide for the future, when families and communities prepare for the long term. There is a difference between living for today and planning for tomorrow, and we will help to make that difference pay.
The Conservatives' savings tax proposals mean people would pay no tax if they were earning less than £32,000 a year. That may benefit some 15 million savers. It'd be worth £120 a year on a £10,000 saving account. Today, ministers have been promoting their plans to cut the tax bills of families with children and painting the Tories' ideas in unflattering colours.
The Conservative sums don't add up. They haven't come up with a single credible proposal to pay either for their spending cuts or for the tax reductions they propose. And when you actually look at what they're proposing, you find that most of the gain would go to the people at the top end of the income scale, nearly 75 times as much as those on the lowest end of the income scale.
To the Liberal Democrats, promising good care for the old and those who need it is ambition enough. There's no need to throw in tax cuts too. The Lib Dem leader, Charles Kennedy, has been attacking both the bigger parties. Today again, the Tories.
It seems to me that the figures don't add up and that this is in line with the way in which the Conservatives have been conducting themselves in opposition. They somehow want to con people into believing that you can tax less and spend more. Well, you can't.
This auction of rival tax cuts isn't over yet. There'll be more tax-cutting bids from the Tories in coming weeks. But the Chancellor still has a budget up his sleeve. And when he unveils that to the Commons next month, he'll have a budget surplus of £10 billion or more to play with. It won't all go on tax cuts, of course, but there'll be cash to give away, without appearing to be reckless. Gordon Brown's expected to set the aim of lifting 1 million more children out of poverty, an old Labour ambition combined with a new Labour pitch to middle-class, middle-income families. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
Our political editor Andrew Marr is at Westminster. Andrew, what does all this tell us about who the politicians think are the key voters in this coming election?
Well, very interesting. We've got both parties going with roughly the same amounts of money to totally different groups of voters. On the one hand, the Conservatives are going for savers, very often older voters, people looking at their building society account books, and they're doing that because they're absolutely sure that older voters, much more reliable voters, they come out in much bigger numbers than younger people, are crucial to their success and their heartland vote. Labour, meanwhile, are going for young families. And again, why? Because the move of younger women in particular over to the Labour Party was a big factor in their 1997 success, and these people have drifted away from Labour. So as one seasoned, if somewhat cynical, Westminster Observer has just put it, it's a little bit like the contest between the pushchair vote and the wheelchair vote.
Well, we've got the budget coming up. We've got more Tory tax cut plans, apparently. How many more carrots are going to be dangled in front of us?
Oh, quite a few, I think. Both parties have more tax giveaways to come between now and budget day, and indeed after the budget too, I suspect. There's a very interesting difference in philosophy here between Gordon Brown's very, very ambitious, interventionist, powerful Treasury and the Conservatives' determination to push power away from the Treasury and into independent schools and universities and savers. In Tory terms, it's a bit like the revolt of the small platoons. Gordon Brown, meanwhile, is very, very slow to open his wallet, and I suppose the irony of this at the end is that he himself, in his guts, is one of those savers, those prudent, thrifty savers that William Hague is now targeting nationally.
Andrew Marr, thanks very much. The head of the prison service in England and Wales has threatened to resign unless prison governors support his plans to improve failing jails. In a speech he described as the most important he'd ever made, Martin NAREY said he was no longer prepared to apologise for degrading, intolerable conditions and the immoral treatment of many inmates.
This is Birmingham, just the latest in a long line of jails to be condemned by prison inspectors. Their report, due out soon, will describe conditions as filthy and appalling. One mentally ill inmate was denied a change of clothes for several weeks. For the head of the prison service, dealing with such criticism is nothing new, and he's had enough. Today he said he was no longer prepared to apologise for what he called this litany of failure and moral neglect. The message to his own prison governors and management teams was support me in making change happen, or I'll find an easier way of earning a living.
I'm fed up of having to deal with critical inspection after critical inspection and apologise for what's gone wrong without making the underlying changes. I want a prison service of which we can all be proud.
Mr. NAREY said year after year dreadful and scandalous conditions were exposed, and it was time to stop blaming a lack of resources or overcrowding. The service either accepted the challenge or accepted the unacceptable. He pointed to some once notorious jails to show how it can be done. The governor of one of them said all managers in the service should back the Director General.
We can come up with the goods. More importantly, we are coming up with the goods. It's only in a minority of places that we aren't managing properly. But what's important about Martin's message is that it don't need more staff and money to actually get the basics right, which is treating prisoners with dignity, cleanliness, and a huge array of things like that.
The Home Secretary, Jack Straw, was at the conference tonight to announce more money to reduce prisoner suicides. He was said to have given the Director General his full support. For Martin NAREY, defending the indefensible is not an option. For instance, he's quite prepared to admit that this prison, Wormwood Scrubs, was once what he calls a hellhole. But along with a handful of others, it's now changing for the better. The question is whether all prisons can come up to scratch, or whether Mr. NAREY will be forced to resign a disappointed man. Jane Peel, BBC News at Wormwood Scrubs.
The British ambassador in Saudi Arabia is holding urgent talks tonight with Saudi officials over a British man who's facing the death penalty. Alexander Mitchell appeared on Saudi television last night, along with a Canadian and a Belgian, confessing to 2 bomb attacks in the Saudi capital last year. If found guilty, the men could be publicly executed.
My name is Alexander Hutton Johnston Mitchell.
The alleged confessions were dramatic. Alexander Mitchell, calling himself a British technician at a military hospital in Riyadh, nervously gave details.
I confirm and confess that I was ordered to carry out an explosion here in Riyadh.
Who ordered the car bomb, he didn't say, but he confirmed the target was Christopher Rodway, the British engineer who was killed and his wife injured in an explosion last November. A second alleged accomplice, William Sampson, a Canadian marketing consultant, then added his confession.
I detonated the explosive device using a remote control switch. Mr. Mitchell and I then headed south towards Al Jazeera.
Neither man gave a motive, but they also confessed to a second bombing which injured 4 people. This time there was another accomplice, a Belgian, who got drawn in after overhearing their conversation. Up till now, these bomb attacks had been a mystery. Several foreigners had been detained over the last 2 months, including 6 Britons, but the British Embassy was told they were being held for alcohol offences. When consular officials saw Mr. Mitchell in custody last week, they say there was no indication of anything more serious, though Saudi papers had suggested the bombings might be linked to an alcohol smuggling feud. The Foreign Office says that the main priority of tonight's meeting between the British ambassador and Saudi officials is to establish just how that television confession came about, when a week ago there was no sign of it. The immediate aim is to establish just on what grounds these men are now being held. Bridget Kendall, BBC News, at the Foreign Office.
The Libyan leader, Colonel Gaddafi, has said the man found guilty of the Lockerbie bombing is innocent. In a wide-ranging attack lasting several hours, he accused Britain and the United States of interfering in the trial of Abdel Basset al-Magrahi, but he produced no fresh evidence about who else might have carried out the bombing. Here, a former soldier, his wife and their 2 small children have been shot dead at their home in Camberley in Surrey. The couple have been named tonight as Anthony and Kay Smith. He was a former sergeant in the Coldstream Guards. Police say they're not looking for anyone else over the deaths.
The tragic discovery was made shortly before 9:30 this morning on a small private estate alongside the M3 motorway. Police were called to the detached home after worried neighbours noticed that milk and papers had not been taken in. The 4 bodies were found in different upstairs rooms.
Well, we're talking about gunshot wounds to the people within that house. So obviously it's a very tragic scene and set of circumstances that my officers are dealing with at the moment, and they're dealing with it very sensitively, of course.
As forensic scientists carried out a detailed investigation, those who died were identified as Anthony and Kay Smith, with their 2 young children. Mr. Smith, who'd served in the Coldstream Guards, is believed to have been working at a local car dealership. The family had moved to the estate last summer. Neighbours, who include a mix of civilian and military households, found it hard to take in what had happened.
Stunned. My wife and I saw it on the lunchtime news about 1:30. It came on as a flash. We were just speculating, we're in Camberley and we've lived here 20 years, never seen anything like this.
As forensic work and door-to-door inquiries continued, the 4 bodies were taken away to undergo a full post-mortem, due to be completed later tonight. The estate is still sealed off. Police will resume their inquiries here tomorrow morning. Detectives hope their interviews with residents will provide some scrap of information to help them establish what led to this tragedy. Robert Hall, BBC News, Surrey.
3 people died as freezing weather swept across Scotland and northern England. Ice and snowdrifts of up to 20 feet closed major roads, and 200 homes in the Scottish borders were left without electricity. More severe weather is expected tomorrow. A 24-hour strike by train drivers on London Underground caused severe disruption this morning. Several tube lines had no service at all, and others ran a reduced timetable. Buses were particularly packed as commuters tried to find other ways of getting to work. George Best has been admitted to hospital in Belfast. The former Manchester United star is understood to be suffering from pneumonia, and his condition is described as poorly but not life-threatening. He was treated in a London hospital last year for liver problems. In 2 days' time, the man who was once thrown out of the Israeli government following a disastrous war in Lebanon looks set to become the country's new Prime Minister. Polls suggest Ariel Sharon, leader of the right-wing Likud party, will sweep to victory over his rival Ehud Barak. The Palestinians say a Sharon victory would do more harm to the faltering peace process. Our World Affairs editor John Simpson reports from Jerusalem.
This is the election which will show that the old peace process is finally dead. And with it, the hopes of Ehud Barak, the Prime Minister.
I'm not worried.
But if so, he's the only Labour supporter who isn't worried. Mr. Barak came in by a landslide only 21 months ago, promising peace. He's failed utterly to deliver it. By contrast, his opponent, the old war horse Ariel Sharon, has a ferocious reputation, but has been promising in this campaign to bring peace. Peace, that is, on Israel's terms. It's an unbeatable offer, if it can be done. Last September, he went for a walk on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, sacred to Muslims as Al-Haram al-Sharif. The current Palestinian uprising began. The violence is likely to sweep Mr. Barak away and Mr. Sharon into power. In what are probably Mr. Barak's last hours in government, Israeli settlers on the West Bank block a road, and the police move in to stop them. The settlers clearly expect that under Mr. Sharon, this will all be different.
Do you see all these soldiers Sharon, instead of making them fight against Jews and settlers, will bring them to fight the Arabs.
Whether that's true or not, Mr. Sharon does court confrontation. In the old city of Jerusalem, he owns a house right in the middle of the Muslim quarter. He doesn't really live here, but there has to be a day and night guard on the place. His Muslim neighbours regard it all as an affront, but they're so disillusioned by Mr. Buerk's failure to bring peace, they insist there's no difference between him and Mr. Sharon.
I prefer Sharon.
Why?
Because we want to find the end for this, problems,
What sort of end would that mean, though? A peaceful
end? The end of the occupation.
But a peaceful end?
I don't believe in peace, in this country.
That's a reaction born of real despair. Nearby, the regulars at the Muna Tea House would probably have supported Mr. Buerk's efforts in the past. Now they too think Mr. Sharon will bring violence and bloodshed. But the optimists, both on the Palestinian and the Israeli side, don't necessarily accept the idea that Sharon will mean an automatic Armageddon. On the contrary, some of them even think it might be easier for him to negotiate peace. But that may not be altogether realistic. John Simpson, BBC News, Jerusalem.
Here, Liverpool's Alderhay Hospital has denied claims by the pathologist at the centre of the organ scandal that it was responsible for the crisis. Professor Dick van Veltzen said he had done nothing wrong in removing thousands of children's organs and blamed the hospital's management for failing to explain post-mortems to parents. Our Social Affairs editor Neil Dixon reports.
Dick van Veltzen may be medical public enemy number one, but he is unrepentant. In his version of events, he did not strip out organs from children against their parents' wishes. He did not falsify records. He did not lie. It's a version of events Lee Doherty does not recognise. When his baby daughter Katie died, Van Veltzen stripped every organ from her body. Lee says he has proof that Van Veltzen never sought permission either from him or from the coroner.
He's calculated what he's done. He's got no remorse for what he's done. And the apologies, that he doesn't really give an apology to us. We want answers, and he's given us nothing at all.
Van Veltzen blames managers and staff at Alderhay for failing to ensure that parents gave full consent and for failing to give him the resources he needed. The hospital accepts there were major failings, but says he contributed to them.
It can't just be down to a systems failure. There were people involved in this, and Professor Van Veltzen was himself central to the large-scale retention of children's organs.
And his colleagues in pathology today rejected Van Veltzen's other central claim that removing all the organs of nearly every child was internationally recognised good practice. And that was not all they disputed.
The inquiry report cites a large number of professional misdemeanours, not just the taking of organs without full consent, but also the falsification of post-mortem reports, which apparently referred to microscopic examination of the tissues, when in fact that clearly hadn't been done.
The NHS is understandably anxious to distance itself from Dick Van Veltzen. According to his fellow pathologists, he was a maverick who damaged himself, his profession, and above all, the parents of dead children. But all that does not disguise wider failings in this area, nor indeed the urgent need to restore confidence in the whole business of organ donation. Neil Dixon, BBC News.
Vauxhall is to build the new Vectra at Ellesmere Port in Cheshire, safeguarding more than 1,200 jobs. And Ford has said it's creating 600 jobs at its plant at Bridgend in South Wales. It's a boost for that region after the steelmaker Chorus said last week that it's shedding thousands of jobs.
One half of the double boost for British manufacturing comes to Ellesmere Port on Merseyside, where Vauxhall will build the new Vectra. But workers going on shift today had mixed feelings. They get some work previously destined for the doomed sister plant in Luton.
They are positive for us, and that's what makes me feel a bit sad, because I would have liked to seen these lads down in Luton still having their job.
I think it's fantastic. I feel sorry for Luton, but for this plant it's fantastic.
And Ford in Bridgend expands its engine plant. Wales taking work from America. Ford's moving towards Britain, making a quarter of all the engines in any of its cars anywhere.
Wherever they are in the world. Bridgend engine plant provides the power for those units, both here in Europe and to be exported throughout the world.
So good news today for Britain, in contrast to last week's steel closures. The climate for British manufacturers is changing slightly, with the pound-euro exchange rate moving in favour of exporters. The worst may be over, though profits still don't come easy. Stephen Evans, BBC News.
There's some hope tonight for policyholders at the beleaguered insurance company Equitable Life, after the Halifax Bank offered to buy up all Equitable's assets in a deal worth £1 billion. The proposal will have to be put to a vote of its policyholders.
Staff at Equitable Life can breathe a sigh of relief tonight. Its directors have been struggling to find a buyer since July, when the House of Lords ruled it must fully honour guaranteed levels of retirement income. If this deal's approved, the 400-strong sales force will work for the Halifax. £1 billion would be injected into Equitable's stricken with profits fund. £500 million would be paid on the 1st of March, and a further £500 million if policyholders vote to approve it. Policyholders with guarantees would be asked to swap them for a lump sum.
It gives a powerful incentive for them to accept a compromise so that the fund can be put on to a stronger footing, and that will improve investment freedom so we can achieve higher returns for all policyholders going forward.
Equitable needs to persuade half its policyholders to back the deal. It also has to be approved by the High Court and financial regulators, a process which will take months. Some of those without guarantees have already lost patience and withdrawn their money, even though it meant paying a 10% penalty.
The only thing that does upset me with it is that it's the with profits fund that has been charged. So we've had charges, we've lost money on the with profits fund, which was sold to me as being the safest fund that I could invest in.
What's not clear is whether this deal is in the best financial interests of those people who do have guaranteed rates of retirement income. Those guarantees are so valuable that some policyholders may feel they're better off turning this offer down. Halifax is hoping that by helping Equitable, it can secure their consent. Andrew Verity, BBC News.
Beef farmers in the United States are becoming increasingly fearful of BSE, even though there hasn't been a single case of the disease there yet. An entire herd is being destroyed because it was found the animals had eaten feed containing the remains of other cattle, the method by which the disease is thought to have spread here. From Texas, Stephen Sacker reports.
Texas cattle country, where the cowboy is king and the beef makes America's finest steaks.
Whoa, come on, girls.
Don Nance's family have run this ranch for generations. Now, for the first time, he's worried about mad cow disease. Texas doesn't want Europe's problem.
We've got to do anything we can to protect our industry. And if that's a ban on letting anything come in from Europe, so be it.
America boasts well over 100 million cattle and not a single case of BSE ever. Farmers and government officials here say they've learned from the mistakes made in Britain and Europe, but that doesn't mean they can rest easy. Last month, a scare. This Texas mill illegally distributed cattle feed which contained remains of locally slaughtered cow. The herd which ate the feed showed no sign of BSE, but is being destroyed as a precaution. In fact, up to 1/4 of America's feed mills are thought to be flouting the strict standards imposed to keep BSE out of America. And that worries conscientious feed producers like Bob Brzezinski.
If it did ever get here, it would be devastating to this country.
Why?
Just because of the amount of cattle that are in this country. Between dairy cattle and beef cattle, it'd ruin this livestock industry in the United States.
And the worry is spreading. In Washington, there have been urgent meetings at the cattlemen's headquarters, the aim to reassure the public.
We pledge our continued vigilance and commitment to BSE prevention in the U.S.
The mad cow scare has even affected America's blood supplies. People who've spent significant time in Britain and a number of other European countries are no longer allowed to give blood. And scientists now routinely examine cattle brains on the lookout for BSE, though critics say the testing should be more widespread.
I think this is the time to go back and re-examine our priorities and say, are we doing enough? And I think the answer is no, not yet.
Rodeo night in Fort Worth, Texas, where raising cattle is more than a business, it's a way of life. Americans think their beef is the best in the world, which is why keeping mad cow disease at bay is now an urgent national priority. Stephen Sacker, BBC News, Texas.
OK, it's 25 past 10. I'll be back a little later with an update on the day's headlines, but now we join our news teams across the UK.